Good afternoon. Thank you again for coming on this week before spring break and midterms and other things going on. We're delighted by the turnout, and this is an amazing event, and we're thankful that you are here with us to meet our distinguished speaker. My name is Lisa Carriaga-Lowe, and I'm Assistant Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity here at Harvard. On behalf of Senior Vice Provost and soon-to-be Harvard College Dean, Evelyn Hammonds, right there, we actually want to congratulate you. And certainly the numerous sponsors of this event, I'd like to thank all of you for attending this very special lecture. This event would not have been possible without the enthusiasm, work, and commitment of numerous individuals from the following organizations, and there are many: the Harvard College Women's Center, the Office for Postdoctoral Affairs, the Office of Faculty Development and Diversity, the Committee on Degrees in Women, Gender, and Sexuality, the Women's Network of Harvard, the GLBT Faculty and Staff Steering Committee, yay, and the Joint Committee for the Status of Women at Harvard Medical School and Harvard School of Dental Medicine. In particular, I would like to say a special thanks to Linda Schneider over there and Susan Marine for their very thoughtful contributions to ensuring that this event come to fruition. The format of today's event will include introductions followed by the keynote address, and then what we hope will be a very, very lively discussion period where we invite you to ask questions of Professor Barris and make brief comments. We have actually index cards that folks will be handing out, if you wish, in case you would like to write your question down, and we'll collect them soon after Professor Barris's lecture. But otherwise, feel free to ask your questions out loud after his lecture. So if you want an index card, raise your hand and we'll pass them around. And we'll leave a few of them on the rows as well. And afterwards at 5:30 p.m., we hope you will join us for a reception honoring Professor Barris in Tickner Lounge right next door. So we are here today because, in fact, gender matters still in the academy. In the 2006 National Academy of Sciences report entitled Beyond Bias and Barriers, Fulfilling the Potential of Women in Academic Science and Engineering, data from a wide variety of studies and across different levels of the academic pipeline reiterated today's reality that, quote, women scientists and engineers still face barriers to success in every field of science and engineering, a record that deprives the country of an important source of talent, unquote. Our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Ben Barris, will share with us his own personal reflections on the obstacles that women in academic science continue to face. To introduce him, we are honored to have with us another distinguished scientist and scholar here in our own backyard, Barbara Gross, Higgins Professor of Natural Sciences in the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and Interim Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. Known for her seminal contributions in the field of artificial intelligence, Professor Gross developed some of the earliest and most influential computer dialogue systems and established the research field of computational modeling of discourse. Her work on computational models of collaboration helped launch the field of inquiry and provides the framework for several collaborative multi-agent systems and human-computer interface systems. She has served as the Dean of Science at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute since 2001. Professor Gross is widely respected for her contributions to the advancement of women in science. As chair of Harvard's 2005 Task Force on Women in Science and Engineering, she led efforts to analyze and make recommendations for building and sustaining the participation of women in academic science and engineering. She also chaired the Faculty of Arts and Sciences Standing Committee on the Status of Women, and more recently, she was a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Maximizing the Potential of Women in Academic Science and Engineering, which produced the seminal report Beyond Bias and Barriers. And in 2008, Professor Gross was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, among the highest professional distinctions accorded an engineer. We are very, very privileged to have with us today Professor and Dean Barbara Gross.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It is a pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Ben Barres, Professor of Neurobiology, Developmental Biology, and Neurology at the Stanford University School of Medicine. I first saw the name Ben Barres in early October 2004 in an email message with the subject, Ray, Total Lack of Women Winners of the NIH Director's Pioneer Award. By the way, if you think that email is ever private or ever goes away, you should think again. As Dr. Barres has just discovered, but I do have his permission to read this to you. This was a long chain of email, and I don't know if this was after many, many people had responded, but at the root of this was a message that Dr. Barres had sent to Dr. Elias Serhouni, the director of NIH, expressing outrage that the winners of this award were all men, and noting that 62 of the 64 evaluators were also men, despite the existence of, as he said, fantastic women biomedical scientists. The message also says, and I quote, "I know you mean well, but I am tired of hearing men say that they mean well, but not back their words up with actions. The buck stops with you. You let this happen on your watch. Please fix this. This situation is totally unfair and completely demoralizing to all of the wonderful women students, postdocs, and professors in this country. This is just unconscionable." Ben Barres doesn't mince words. He also doesn't simply talk. He succeeded, along with others, in convincing NIH to change the process for selecting Pioneer Award winners to a more open and considered one. And in 2005, 6 of the 13 winners were women. Subsequent years have also seen a mix of men and women. And oh yes, there have been people of color and a broader range of ethnicities too. It's really interesting to go look at the Pioneers Award website and see the change in population over years. I next received email from Dr. Barres during what some of us call the troubles at Harvard. I was struck that a white male would speak so knowingly and so forcefully and so persistently, seemingly without concern for the impact on his own career or reputation, about a topic that was and remains fraught in way too many ways. Dr. Barres is a highly distinguished neurobiologist whose research on brain development and function, which focuses on such key issues as the role of astrocytes at synapses, the basis of central nervous system regenerative failure, myelin repair, and the blood-brain barrier, is advancing our understanding of how the brain works and addressing problems of fundamental importance to such diseases as multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, and glaucoma. Barres presently serves as co-chair of the Department of Neurobiology at Stanford. He has won many teaching awards, including the Kaiser Award for Excellence in Preclinical Teaching and the Kaiser Award for Outstanding Contributions to Medical Education. He is the creator and director of the Masters of Science in Medicine program, a new program at Stanford University to train PhD students about human biology and disease. He serves on many editorial boards, including Neuron and the Journal of Cell Biology, an expert scientist and a wonderful educator. Dr. Barres received a bachelor's degree at MIT, an MD degree at Dartmouth Medical School, did an internship and residency in neurology at the Cornell Cooperating Hospital Program, a PhD with David Corey at Harvard Medical School, and had a postdoctoral fellowship with Martin Rath at University College London. I hope all of you have had an opportunity to read Dr. Barres's commentary in the July 2000 issue of Nature. If not, I know we were handing it out, and I recommend it. This article makes abundantly clear not only Dr. Barres's understanding of the situation for women and other minorities in science, consider his comments about being treated with respect and being allowed to finish sentences, as well as of men being unconscious of the privileges that come with being male, but also consider his commitment to getting the facts right. He is a scientist, he respects data, and that too makes all the difference. Dr. Barres also understands how much resources matter, and that it is not simply a matter of what women in science have been able to do despite bias and barriers, as the recent NAS report cites, but what they might have been able to do, what they might have been able to accomplish were the world of science different. As we face a decline in interest in scientific careers among students, including among white men as well as women and minorities, this understanding is ever more crucial to the nation. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I did work in computational linguistics, and I will tell a short story before I conclude. John Perry, a philosopher of language at Stanford, wrote a paper on identity in which he tells the story of someone going around noticing while he's shopping that there's a trail of sugar on the floor. And he decides to be a good citizen, and so he follows this trail of sugar, trying to find the person whose bag has a leak. He goes round and round, and eventually it dawns on him that the trail is getting thicker and thicker. And he says, "Ah, it's me." He goes on in this paper to say what it means, the difference between the person with the leaking bag, to understand that it's you, and talks about identity. It's a wonderful paper. I recommend it to you. As a transgendered person, Dr. Barris has lived as both a female and a male. As he was only born once, so far as I know, his innate capabilities remain stable, but his treatment by colleagues has not. When Barris heard that someone had said his science was better than his sister's, he could not react as my twin brother, who, along with my 7th grade math teacher, did the most to encourage me in science, as my brother would have, by pointing out that I might be much less good at hearing no than he is, but for sure I'm not a less good scientist. Barris couldn't react that way because his sister was him. This anecdote tells us a lot, but as Barris himself makes clear, it is the data that matter, and I know we'll hear more about that today. Dr. Barris has displayed extraordinary courage more than once. First, for pursuing his own identity, and second, in pursuing good for others. In speaking out for women and minorities in science, he has risked his own standing for our benefit. Please join me in saluting as well as welcoming a man of courage.
Don't clap too soon. Thank you very much for your invitation to speak at Harvard today. If I've been successful in my scientific career, I owe it in large part to my Harvard education. Some of the best courses I've ever taken were right here on this campus. For instance, a biochemistry course taught by Guido Guidati and a genetics course taught by Nancy Kleckner. I've received many invitations to speak on the dearth of women in science, but this is the first time I've accepted one. I accepted it because Harvard has long been the center of the battleground for social justice for women and minorities, and I think if any university has the potential to come up with new approaches for solving this problem, it will be here. Now, my talk today is about why there is a dearth of women in science, and perhaps more fundamentally, about the nature of uncovering truth in science and how biases undermine that search. I'm going to be talking for exactly 1 hour, and I apologize, I know that's a little bit long. There's some things that I really need to say today, and I don't think I'll be invited back anytime soon. Now, first, I would like to talk today about the problem. Then I'd like to tell you a little bit about me, my commentary. Then I'd like to spend some time talking about Steve Pinker's hypothesis that men and women have evolved innately different cognitive circuits that may help to account for the dearth of women in science. I'd like to spend a few moments talking about some of Harvey Mansfield's related ideas. And then I'd like to talk about the great harm done by stereotypes, why enhancing diversity is important, and then finally some thoughts about what might be done. Now, I'm going to be spending a good bit of time today talking about Steve Pinker's ideas and why I disagree. At times it may seem like I'm being very tough on him, but he is a public figure. He has been very honest in his views, which takes great courage in these days of political correctness. And more importantly, his ideas represent a view shared by Darwin and quite a few other scientists and non-scientists. And so, although I will be using Steve Pinker as an example, I'm really directing my comments toward a much broader group of people. The same is true for comments I will make about Harvey Mansfield, who shares views about women held by many of the great philosophers. Both men are leading intellectuals, brilliant writers, and teachers. But it is because of their high status that their views are influential, and therefore that they have special responsibility to be sensitive to the harmful effects of their work. Okay. I appreciate that there may be many different points of view on some of the topics I will discuss, and I am certain that all of you are well-meaning, fair-minded people who agree that treatment of individuals should be based on merit rather than on race, gender, or religious stereotypes. But it's the question of whether academia is in fact a meritocracy that's at the heart of my comments today. You've got my email address. Feel free to email me. I understand the talk is being videotaped, so if you have to leave early, if you still want to see the end, you can. And if anyone should want my slides or like a copy of my commentary, don't hesitate to contact me. Okay, so I'd like to begin by telling you about the problem that concerns me, which is the very low number of women professors. Women have received more college degrees than men in every year since 1982, so there's not an entering pipeline problem. Furthermore, as this slide shows, women are now 50% of graduate students in the vast majority of academic disciplines, and even in many disciplines in science, although there are certain fields like physical sciences and engineering where the numbers lag behind, but as you can see, they're rapidly growing also. Despite this large number of women in the pipeline, when you actually look at how many women are in the professoriate and are reaching full professor, and this is an average made from departments in 50 top science and engineering schools, but keep in mind the numbers get even lower if you look at the top 10. And you can see that in many of these disciplines, there's only 3% of the full professors that are women, and so on average it's about 10 or so percent. And you may think this is only true for science, but it's not. If you average all of the academic areas together, you end up with something like only 20% women, including in academic areas such as humanities. And by the way, on average, they still only receive 80% of their male faculty salaries. So, why is there this underrepresentation? At a talk several years ago, the Harvard president at the time, Larry Summers, offered some conjectures. This question of the low faculty diversity was a question that he had given some thought to because during his time as Harvard president, the rate of women being tenured had been plummeting. In order of importance, he suggested that women choose family over the 84 work weeks required in most careers. And second, he suggested that there might likely be some innate brain differences accounting for why fewer women were able to achieve at the very highest level of science. He did not think that discrimination was much of a factor, although I believe that he's since changed his mind on that. Now, his suggestion that women were likely to be innately limited touched the nerve in many people. MIT professor Nancy Hopkins, a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a longtime advocate for women in science, said she physically felt ill as a result of his comments and walked out of the conference room in disgust. So why did Professor Summers suggest that women might have an innate limitation? The reason is, in effect, one of the reasons he cited is an effect known as the more geniuses, more idiots effect. Though men and women have the same average IQ and math test scores, men have the very best and the very worst scores, and you're supposed to see from this graph, the men are in purple, that at the various highest scores, there might be a tad more men scoring up at that level. Well, I think that one reason that this general idea that women have some innate inferiority is nothing new. For instance, during the women's fight for the vote, the following New York Times articles appeared in 1915. Dr. Baruch also used the more genius, more idiots effect to argue for why women lack great originality and to argue for male superiority. But Rita Dore, a woman, responded with much cynicism about the validity of this explanation, particularly the more genius, more idiots effect, and pointed out that this effect can be used to argue that women will underachieve in all careers, not just science, and is the explanation for much discrimination and lowered expectations that women must contend with. In fact, women have had to listen to famous male scientists tell them their brains are innately inferior for hundreds of years. And this statement from Stephen Jay Gould encapsulates the anger that many women felt towards the comments of Larry Summers. Few tragedies can be more extensive than the stunting of life. Few injustices deeper than the denial of opportunity to strive or even to hope by a limit opposed from without but falsely identified as lying within. But throughout history, women and minorities have steadily disproven every biological limit ascribed to them. Okay, now I'd like to turn to telling you a little bit about my lab. I became very interested in Summers' comments because as a mentor, I am intensely interested in seeing all of my students be successful in their scientific careers, including the half of my students that are women. These talented women have fulfilled their end of the social contract. They have trained and worked extremely hard. All they want is a meritocracy. I feel very lucky to have had such an intensely fulfilling career, and I would like to see talented women scientists have the same opportunity. So I would like to take a short aside here to tell you about a few of the wonderful women scientists that were in my lab while Larry Summers was making his comments. Now, my lab studies the development and plasticity of neural circuits in the brain, with a particular interest in the role of a mysterious class of brain cells called astrocytes. And early on, my lab had developed methods to purify different cell types in the brain and to separate neurons from a class of glial cells called astrocytes. And we found, to our great surprise, that neurons are unable by themselves to form synapses without signals from astrocytes. And this is Karen Christofferson. Karen is a postdoctoral fellow in my lab, identified the astrocyte-derived signal as a protein called thrombospondin. It's made only in the developing brain by astrocytes. And it's one of the only known secreted signals that is sufficient to induce synapses. And interestingly, it turns out to be one of the few proteins that are much more highly expressed in human brain compared to primate brain. This raised the question of the identity of the neuronal receptor through which thrombospondin acted, and this project was taken up by Chala Eroglu in my lab. This is Chala, and this receptor she found turns out also to be the receptor. She identified it as a calcium channel subunit, alpha-2 delta-1, and this turns out, to our great surprise, to be the receptor for a blockbuster drug called gabapentin or Neurontin, whose mechanism of action has long been a mystery. And Chala showed that gabapentin works by completely blocking the ability of neurons to form excitatory synapses in vitro and in vivo. She's now submitted this for publication, and this picture on the right is a picture of Chala. She's now pregnant, expecting in a few months. And then lastly, I wanted to tell you about Beth Stevens, and I forgot to say that Chala's on her way to starting her assistant professorship at Duke University this summer. And then Beth Stevens is another postdoc in my lab shown here, working on a related project, recently determined that astrocytes trigger the expression, another big surprise to us, of a part of the immune system that wasn't even thought to be expressed in the brain, called the classical complement cascade. And she showed that this cascade is required to destroy the excess over-generated synapses in the normal developing brain. And she further showed that although this cascade turns off in the adult brain, it turns back on early in brain diseases in which massive synapse loss occur, such as Alzheimer's disease. And so she suspects that this cascade is actually driving the neurodegeneration process. And Beth just had a baby. There she is with her baby, and she'll be heading off actually to Harvard for her assistant professorship this summer. I don't know what I'm going to do without them. Now, all of these findings by these three women have been published in the very top science journals, are profoundly important and highly innovative pieces of work with enormous implications for how our neural circuits develop, as well as for neurological disease. All three of these women filed patent applications and have licensed them to biotech companies to develop new therapies. So my own experience tells me that there is no dearth of incredibly talented women scientists, and I do not take kindly to any president of a major university who would like to suggest that women scientists are biologically limited and innately less talented. Okay, I'd now like to tell you a little bit more about myself. This is me on the left here, in the bridesmaid's dress back when I was Barbara, at my little sister's wedding, and on the right, shortly after my sex change on the right. So this is an aspect of my life that I believe gives me special insight into the troubles that highly talented women face. I was born a woman. 13 years ago, at the age of 40, I decided to change my sex. I did not do this to achieve any male advantage, but rather because of a lifelong gender identity confusion. Perhaps because I was fetally exposed to high doses of androgen, an androgen-like drug, I felt that I was a boy when I was growing up. As a small child, I was into rough play, trucks, guns, model airplanes. I recall dressing up every Halloween as a football player or an army man. It did not bother me much until I was a teenager and became acutely uncomfortable with my physical female development, as well as the idea of shaving my legs, wearing makeup and dresses. My entire life I felt that I was a boy. And when near girls, I would feel intense feelings of discomfort as I felt confused about why I didn't seem to be the same gender as they were. I did not understand why I was different, and I was too ashamed to ever once discuss my feelings with anyone. At the age of 40 years old, I learned about transsexualism and decided to change my sex. Even though I worried that it would seriously harm my scientific career, I found that the opportunity to become a man was irresistible. I changed sex by mastectomies and taking high doses of testosterone. Muscularity, facial hair, and baldness soon followed. The most surprising change to me was the loss of ability to cry. I am not aware of any change in cognitive function or emotion. As is true for greater than 95% of transsexuals, I have been far happier as a man and have never regretted the change even for an instant. My colleagues at Stanford, nationally and internationally, have all been fantastically supportive. I'm not ashamed to be a transsexual. This is who I am. I'm happy, and I have a unique perspective that I would like to share with you today. And as an aside, besides changing sex, the only time in my life when I have taken an action that I thought might harm my career is when I decided to start fighting for the welfare of women in academia. So what is gender identity? Gender identity is a person's innate sense of being male or female. Now, the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists use includes a diagnosis of gender identity disorder or transsexualism, in which one's mental sense of gender identity may differ from his or her anatomic or genetic sex. I am not disordered. I am me. The desire for transsexuals to change sex is irresistibly strong. Many will even cut off their genitals or commit suicide. And of course, transsexuals are the victim of severe job discrimination and violence. In many countries, they are put to death. Society frowns harshly on anyone who dares to step out of their normal gender roles. And I think the point I'll come back to today, that gender identity may help to explain why when women think they are less feminine, if they are good at math, that they underachieve. Now, I want to say that no one understands better than a transsexual that men and women are innately different. But I suspect when it comes to the brain, the main difference of any relevance to this debate is gender identity. Anyone who thinks that career women want gender neutrality doesn't begin to understand the strength of the need we all have for our gender identity. Now, of course, along the way, I have encountered personal occasions and instances of discrimination, and I've outlined some of these in my article, and so I don't want to take time to go through them now. Of course, as a transsexual, I've experienced overt discrimination, for example, health insurance discrimination. But by far the biggest difference I have noticed is that people who do not know that I was a woman treat me with far more respect. Some people even think that my research is better. Shortly after I changed sex, a faculty member was heard to say, "Ben Barris gave a great seminar today, but then his work is much better than his sister's work." And also, people tell me things, men tell me things that I don't think they would have told me when I was Barbara. A neurosurgeon at Stanford told me that he has never met a woman surgeon who is remotely as good as a man. Another told me he thinks women are like small children. Many have told me that they think gender stereotypes are generally true. These experiences have made me vividly aware of gender-based stereotypes and biases. Also, since becoming transgendered, I've become aware that there are many students and academics who are gay, who are still closeted, even in the Bay Area, to my great surprise, for fear of harmful repercussions to their lives and careers. I always advise them to be open about who they are, including on job interviews, and I have yet to see one not get their first choice job. Your difference is your greatest advantage. Don't let others take your happiness away. Now, I'd like to turn to a phenomenon known as stereotype threat. I think the phenomenon of transsexuality has much to teach us about the great harmfulness of gender stereotypes. One of the scientifically demonstrated harms of stereotypes is a phenomenon known as stereotype threat, and this is best known from the work of Stanford African-American psychologist Claude Steele. Steele and others have shown that women score far lower on a math test if they are reminded before they take the test that women are less good in math than men. Many people, it's a very robust effect. It's been shown for African Americans, for women repeatedly. Anyone who's tried to reproduce it has observed enormous effects. Here's a recent reproduction that was published in Science from Dar Nimrod and Hein. And you can see that these effects are enormous. Women who are reminded that women don't do so well in math, often half and sometimes even third the scores they would otherwise obtain. And interestingly, these authors found that the effect was particularly severe when the idea was implanted that a woman's math abilities are lesser because of an innate difference in their brains rather than due to social effects. If you tell them it's just social, they do fine. But if you tell them it's because they have an innate limitation, they don't do well. And to me, this finding strongly suggests the threat is to a woman's sense of gender identity. Many people think the social forces that cause women to do less well at math have more to do with neglect. But women may also actively reject learning math if they think that learning math will make them less womanly. In any case, these studies show the enormous harm done to women by stereotypes. Women are surrounded by constant stereotype threat. All male faculty, all male speakers, lecturers that only mention the work of men, pictures of men on the wall, and so forth. This threat is likely not only to their math ability, but to every ability linked to masculinity or to femininity by a stereotype. Given the great harm of gender stereotypes, and I'll come more later in this talk to the harm of gender stereotypes, scientists who want to say that women are innately less good at math, science, etc., have an enormous responsibility to be aware of the potential harmfulness of their work and to uphold a very strong level of scientific rigor and evidence. Okay, now I'd like to come back to the aftermath of the Summers talk. As many of you know, there was incredible press coverage. It was vicious, and reporters referred to it as the story that will not die. Most stories last a few days, the public gets bored, they want to hear something else. This story just went on and on for months. Soon after his comments, the Harvard Corporation, led by Hannah Gray, a woman, decided to give Professor Summers a large pay raise. African-American lawyer Conrad Harper resigned from the corporation in disgust, this pay raise. And to my amazement, there was total silence from the top scientific leadership in this country. Nancy Hopkins received over 1,000 emails, half from men and half from women. The men and women that wrote to her had dramatically different perspectives. The messages from women were nearly all strongly supportive. The messages from men were angry, abusive, and often pornographic. She is still receiving them. And this is an example. Hi, Ms. Hopkins. Are you still there? It's hard to believe that MIT is still employing someone who publicly denounced the scientific method. When I was a student there, the scientific method was central to a scientific career. How low the institute has fallen. Are you recovering from your vapors? It's difficult to believe that that he would have been so disrespectful to an equally distinguished male MIT professor. In addition, Steve Pinker argued that people were so angry at Larry Summers' comments because the idea that women are innately inferior is so dangerous that it's sinful even to think about, and it should be taboo. I disagree. Women are angry because what is being said is untrue and is wrongly depriving them of their careers and fulfilling lives. But Harvard Law School professor Alan Dershowitz sympathized so much with this view that he decided to teach a course with Professor Pinker this past year called Morality and Taboo. And Larry Summers was invited. And he would have none of what they were saying, and he admitted, I think it was in respect an act of spectacular imprudence. And he regretted the harm that his comments had done. And although to my knowledge he still thinks there's a cognitive innate difference between men and women, he apologized for the harm, which I think shows great integrity on his part. Now, there were other concurrent events that snapped me out of my denial about the existence of gender bias in academia. As is true for many successful scientists, I had never thought much about gender discrimination. It did not occur to me that it was a serious problem. After all, if I could attain tenure and full professorship as a woman, why couldn't every other woman? It didn't occur to me to think that I might have just been lucky or that I might have been successful by being several times more productive than comparable men in my career cohort. But in addition to Larry Summers' comments, there was the work of Steven Pinker, who put forth an identical point of view to Summers in his book, The Blank Slate, that came out in 2002, as did a famous scientist, Sir Peter Lawrence, as did Harvey Mansfield, argue similarly in Manliness. And of course, as you heard from Barbara Groves, I also was concerned about the effective exclusion of women from elite scientific competitions. And so I want to particularly focus in the next part of my talk on the views of Steven Pinker as it seems to me that Larry Summers has relied on Pinker for much of his thinking on this topic. So what does Pinker think? Well, he says that men are good at some things and women are good at others. He sees them as sort of a separate but equal. Okay, that sounds pretty good, but let's see what sorts of things he's talking about. Men are innately better at being aggressive. They're more ambitious. They take more risks. They're better at spatial skills and math. They have higher tolerance for pain. Women are innately better at verbal abilities. They feel emotions more strongly. They're more empathetic. They smile and laugh more. And they prefer to take care of children. And from his book, he also says, men are inherently risk-taking achievers who can willingly endure discomfort in pursuit of success, while women are more likely to choose administrative support jobs that offer low pay and air-conditioned offices. And there's an excellent discussion or refutation of his book, of the part of his book on gender, in a book by Rosalind Barnett and Carolyn Rivers that I really recommend. Same difference, how gender myths are hurting our relationships, our children, and our jobs. And particularly concerning to me, he uses these views which he says are rooted in science, and we'll come back to whether they are. He uses these views to then argue about the idea of making any special efforts to increase the representation of women faculty in science departments. Okay, well, I had about enough of this, and I decided to write a commentary. I was practically frothing at the mouth, and my initial commentary was about 3 times longer than it ended up being. And I made the following points in this commentary. First of all, there is no compelling evidence for relevant innate gender differences in cognition. Second, there's overwhelming evidence for severe degrees of gender-based prejudice. Both men and women often deny gender-based bias. I bet you that's true for many of you in this room. We all have a strong desire to believe that the world is fair. But I feel when faculty tell their students that they are innately inferior based on race or gender, that they are crossing a line that should not be crossed, a line that divides responsible free speech from verbal violence. And in a culture where women's abilities are not respected, women cannot effectively learn, advance, lead, or participate in society in a fulfilling way. And I was very surprised by the response to my commentary. I was surprised that Nature did a press release. I was surprised that it was covered by most major newspapers around the world, that I received hundreds of calls from TV folks and radio stations asking to interview me, 8 book offers, hundreds of invitations to speak on the subject, and I received over 3,000 emails from around the world. And to my surprise, less than 10 were at all negative. And about 1/3 of these emails were from men. And most of the emails, male and female, told me of examples of gender-based prejudice in their own lives, and many men and women asked me what they could do to help make things better. And I wanted to show you my favorite email. I've changed the name of the writer. Dear Ben, just wanted to say thanks. I was a Harvard student. I remember strongly a meeting I had with poet Adrienne Rich. I came away from the meeting feeling shocked. I realized it was the first time I'd felt truly taken seriously as a person. And I think this message has a profound message for all of us, particularly as teachers and mentors. I'd also like to tell you about the response from Steven Pinker and Harvey Mansfield. There was an article in the Boston Globe covering my work, and the reporter, Marcella Bombardieri, reported that these professors responded angrily, with Harvard Mansfield calling Barris a political fruitcake, and Steven Pinker saying that Barris has reduced science to Oprah. And he also then wrote a correspondence to Nature, very angry correspondence, in which I only mentioned his name like twice in the whole commentary, as you'll see, lumped in with other people. But I want to just review what he said, because these arguments, it's not just him and me, these arguments are just coming up all the time. Barris's review of scientific studies is one-sided and anecdotal. And my response is that my commentary was rigorously peer-reviewed, unlike his book. Pinker called a simple lie Barris's suggestion that those who write about gender differences are suggesting that a whole group of people is innately wired to fail. It's Pinker who strongly argued for differences in the neural circuits of female that causes their limitation in science. Barris should learn not to take hypotheses so personally. Okay, obviously it's not about me. Men are better at some things and women are better at others. thinkers should learn that hypotheses require supporting data. And I want to come much more to this. More mudslinging at me, calling my commentary a polemic that contains numerous falsehoods and scurrilous statements. Okay, I was not an undergrad at Harvard, so I had to go to the dictionary and look up these words. Okay, a polemic is a text on a topic written specifically to dispute or refute a position or theory that is widely viewed to be beyond reproach. I think that speaks for itself. Scurrilous, grossly or obscenely abusive, contains slander. And I would say that I was not allowed by the reviewers or editors to be abusive, and in fact bent over backwards to be polite. I have never at any time called anyone a name. And as for slander, the editors and reviewers checked every word of my commentary, including the original references, for accuracy and for fairness. So I don't think that those accusations are fair. And I wanted to tell you his last paragraph in his correspondence is for encouraging women in science. In my experience, students of both sexes are attracted to science because it promises an honest investigation into how the world works. Blah, 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 more about moralistic name calling. That didn't refer to me. Let's hope Barris's commentary does not discourage them, okay? And I ask you, what's more discouraging if you're a woman? To be told you're innately limited, or to be told that you're not? Now, also notice the dispassionate, objective search for truth that he's calling for, and notice the utter insensitivity in his words to the harmfulness of comments, okay? I think that his words contribute to a climate in which, until proven otherwise, men are presumed to be competent and women are presumed to be incompetent. And that's why I think it's important to talk about his ideas and whether they're right. And there's another very important point that I'd like to make. Steve said here in blue, it says, look, the truth cannot be offensive. People who storm out of a meeting without providing arguments or evidence don't get the concept of a university or free inquiry. The insensitivity of the statement is stunning. Why would any great scientist, a National Academy member no less, sit in a meeting and be personally insulted and told they are biologically limited? Pinker's responses consisted of vicious ad hominem attacks and denials that he said what he said, and a failure to actually objectively address the actual questions raised about his work. I believe that many people have failed to respond to him as fully as they should because they are afraid to. So today I want to say what I think about the hypothesis about women's lesser innate ability and why I think it's completely wrong. To take such a harmful position, he must be very sure he is right. How can he be so sure? His ideas come from the ideology of evolutionary psychology. And some of you may not have heard of evolutionary psychology before. The goal of this research is to discover and understand the design of the human mind. And here are some of the principles of this field. Our neural circuits were designed by natural selection to solve problems that our ancestors faced. Our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind. Okay, well, maybe our modern skulls do house a Stone Age mind, but there are many serious problems with this approach. It is obvious to any neurobiologist that nothing important about our neural circuits can be figured out by guesswork alone. As Nobel laureate Richard Axel says, before you can know, you must imagine. But then you actually have to do some experiments. A good scientist knows how to formulate testable hypotheses. Okay, and I think that it's very important. And I know that Darwin is a great man, and of course I'm not doubting natural selection. I think it's important to understand the time from which his views came and the views he personally held. And these are some quotes. First, from The Descent of Man by Darwin. The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can women, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of senses and hands. And in his autobiography, he's thinking about whether to get married, and he makes a list about the good things and the bad things of marriage. And on the good things, constant companion, object to be loved and played with, better than a dog anyway, someone to take care of house. And on the disadvantages, he wrote, perhaps my wife won't like London. Then the sentence is banishment and degradation with indolent, idle fool. Okay, and in fact, there's a long feminist perspective about evolution that I bet they don't teach at Harvard. From the first, Darwin was writing. When Darwin was reporting his observations and making his conclusions, women scientists were saying, wait a minute, we don't disagree. And here Eliza Burt Gamble said in her book, The Evolution of Women, an Inquiry into the Dogma of Her Inferiority, although Darwin interpreted his data to indicate that men were superior, when she looked at the same data, she saw female superiority. And I think that Sarah Hardy similarly argued that Darwin's notion of a passive female role in sexual selection stemmed, obviously, from Victorian social conventions of the time. And I think that Harvard professor Ruth Hubbard made an extremely important point in her book. So long as biology is an enterprise and is almost exclusively a male occupation, it will be a biased science, masquerading as objective, and will make unfounded claims about women's biology that will justify the inferior status of women. I think a very important point. And I think her comments raise deep questions about the nature of scientific truth and how it is arrived at. And it's also important to say, although I don't have time to go in them today, that this approach or paradigm of evolutionary psychology has been very controversial from the start. And I think it's fair to say that the critiques of this paradigm from many leading intellectuals have been uniformly devastating. And I think that the best critique, I think, is summarized right here from Harvard professor Richard Lowenton, so I'd like to read it. The problem is that beyond the repeated assertion that there may be an anatomic physiological basis for differences in status, wealth, and power, biological determinists have never found any credible concrete basis for such differences. For all I know, we are being visited daily by extraterrestrial creatures. There's certainly nothing in the laws of physics to prevent it, but I really do require more than out-of-focus snapshots to make me take the possibility seriously. Simply put, no one has ever found any difference between men and women in the genes or neural circuits that control their cognition. So how can Steven Pinker be so sure? This was the subject of the Pinker-Spelke debate. That many of you may have been present for this. Pinker, of course, took the side of nature, and Harvard professor Liz Spelke the side of nurture. And the main points that Pinker made mainly pointed to the fact that there are differences, that there are differences in test scores. He had this idea that gender stereotypes are accurate. But of course, differences themselves don't say why those differences were caused. And the main argument that he could make for nature was that there seemed to be a correlation. In some cases, when human females receive androgens, they have more rough play and stuff like that. This does not prove their cognition or neural circuits are different. Liz Spelke, arguing from her own scientific research, pointed out that there is no scientific evidence for cognitive differences. There are no overall cognitive differences in innate aptitude for science and math. There are some subtle differences, very subtle, that can be brought out by very specific types of tests. I just learned from Liz Spelke today that when people say that men are better at spatial skills, what happens is there's a battery of 44 different tests, and only 3 of those can you see any differences in spatial ability, and 1 women are better at and 2 men are better at. And also, Dr. Spelke has made the point that even these sex differences are not present in infants, but what differences are seen emerge into childhood, so of course could be accounted for by social effects. And of course she makes the point about all the scientific studies that show the strong social forces and biases that can affect math test scores and preferences and choices. Now I want to turn to this more genius, more idiots effect, because this was cited repeatedly by Pinker, by Summers, and by others. It seems obvious to them that if men are getting more of the high test scores out here, the ones with the IQs of 140 and stuff, well then they're the ones who are going to become the future professors and innovators, so that's why there's more men in science. Well actually, I'd like to point out that this idea was tested and proven completely false years ago by Professor Terman, psychologist at Stanford. He helped to develop the original Stanford-Binet IQ test. And so back then, when people were just starting to play around with the IQ test, and to see, his hope was that you could use this IQ test on high school students and then predict which of them were going to be the future innovators. And so to test that, he did an experiment. And he scoured the state of California, giving all high school kids this IQ test. And he culled down to a list of 1,500 kids that scored at the genius level of 135 or above. And he then spent the rest of his career, over 30 years, following what happened to the careers, the lives of these students. And the interesting, but very disappointing to him, result was that although many of these high scorers did in fact go on to become successful professionals, there were very few that demonstrated any innovativeness or creativity. And in fact, the ones that were most innovative fell more down in the IQ level of 120, and he passed over two future Nobel laureates, William Shockley and Linus Pauling. They each had IQs of 120. Furthermore, there's assumption that some people make that highly successful scientists have SAT math scores that are over 700. This isn't true for men or women, and this has been shown from the work of Zhao, Xi, and Xiaoman. Okay, now, there's also lots of increasing evidence that extreme mathematical achievement in women is highly dependent on their cultural status, their social status in their country. And Andrew Penner has a paper almost in press at the American Journal of Sociology where he's shown that women in cultures like Norway and so forth, where women are less discriminated against, in fact perform, there are more women that achieve at a high level. And so he concludes that there's clearly very strong social influences that are hindering women's math performance, and he cites stereotype threat, popularity concerns. Many girls feel when they're young that if they're very good at math that they will be less popular and seen as less female. And also parents encourage their boys. There's much data that parents encourage boys to take more math courses than they encourage their daughters to take. And very importantly, this SAT math test gap in which more men score over 700 than women is very rapidly closing. In 1983, in a group of talented students in the Hopkins Talent Search, there was a ratio of 13 to 1. 13 boys scored over 700 for every girl. But that rapidly is closing so that now, a few years ago, it was down to 3 to 1. Obviously, this cannot be explained by evolution of innate neural circuits. And there's something else which I think is very important, which is when the blank slate was published in the year 2002, Pinker used the 13 to 1 values. And I think this raises a concern about the dispassionate, objective nature of his search for truth. And I'm not pointing my finger at him. I think this is a problem about how to do science. We all get wed to our hypotheses and tend to prefer certain data to other data. But okay, this is all, we're talking about math tests and IQ tests. How do men and women actually compare in solving real-life science problems? This is the work of a new study currently under review by Professor Karim Lakhani and his colleagues at Harvard Business School. There's a new website called incentive.com in which companies post science problems that they've been unable to solve, and if they could be solved, would be very grateful, helpful for their business, so they post large rewards. And people can go to this website, scientists, and sign up to solve one of those problems, and if they solve it, they win. They win a lot of money. And so now that the site has existed for a bunch of years, Dr. Lakhani decided to collect the data and take a look at who these people were that were solving these problems. And to his great amazement, he found that if a woman engaged to solve in one of these problems, she was 3.5 times more likely to solve the problem than the man. Now, I'm not saying that women are better scientists than men. I'm simply saying that the sword cuts both ways. Men and women may measure up differently on different kinds of tests, but there's no reason overall to think that men are scientifically superior. Now, I want to turn to another concern about the blank slate and the way data was interpreted. There's a part in this under gender differences where he talks about Harvard professor Carol Gilligan's work about gender differences in moral reasoning. Her studies showed that women were more concerned about the welfare of groups, whereas men were more concerned about individual rights. She proposed this might have an innate basis which is no longer thought to be true. In any case, Pinker argued that if Gilligan was correct, this would invalidate women from becoming lawyers and Supreme Court justices. Really? Why is the male perspective the only one that counts in defining justice? And in fact, there's a long line of feminine jurisprudence that women are indoctrinated into the male perspective of thinking about ethics in law school. And although there may not be innate differences between men and women in this regard, because of their vastly different life experiences and life perspectives, giving the same starting data, I believe that men and women will likely decide many cases, legal cases, differently. And in fact, there's emerging data that this is the case. And so I am very troubled by the lack of gender balance on the Supreme Court. And I'm more troubled by the failure of women lawyers to fight for this. Okay, now I want to turn to the thing that Pinker said in this debate with Spelke, which troubled me, disturbed me very greatly, more than anything else he said. He claimed that women are less likely or less able to take intellectual risks. So, is this true? He cited a study by Burns et al., which I've listed up here. It turned out to be a meta-analysis of 150 previous studies of risk-taking ability between the men and women. And the main conclusion of this study was a big surprise, whereas the authors expected that they would find that men were much more frequently taking all sorts of risky behavior. That's not what they found. They found when they averaged out all the data, there was virtually no difference between men and women in almost any type of risk-taking ability. There was one test, though, where women were significantly less able to take risks, and that was in an intellectual risk-taking test. But they were 5 age groups, and the really strong effect only occurred in one age group. It was in 10 to 12-year-old girls. It was on a math test. And by the time the girls were 18, the effect was largely disappearing, and there was no data from women over or men over age 21. And by the way, the most strongly significant risk-taking difference they observed between boys and girls was also the risk that boys were more likely to take was also in 10 to 13-year-old boys, and they were more likely to take sexual risks. So I think to use this study to tell a group of adult women that they're less able to take intellectual risks is, it's not right. And I think it is another reason to question Pinker's objectivity in reporting this data. Okay, so I'd like to end this section on Steven Pinker by asking him a few questions. Given all the evidence for bias in social forces and the rapidly improving performance of women on math tests, how can you be so sure that the underrepresentation of women in science reflects innate differences? And very importantly, how can a talented woman that wants to be a scientist be fairly judged by merit when there is a strong stereotype that women in general are less good at science? Why do you ignore the data that doesn't agree with your ideas? And since you view women as having different but equal abilities, how would you like to become a woman with only the abilities you attribute to women? So I think that Pinker's ideas come from an evolutionary psychology framework, and this framework has been questioned, and recently it's been claimed that this framework has yet to produce any single definitive scientific step forward. As Mark Twain said, supposing is good, but finding out is better. It is not sufficient for scientists to formulate an interesting hypothesis and simply talk about its plausibility in publications that are not peer-reviewed. A good scientist formulates testable hypotheses and then does his very best work to disprove his own hypothesis. He discards his hypothesis quickly when data arises that shows it to be wrong. In contrast, a scientist who has a preformed idea ignores data that is inconsistent with his hypothesis. Pinker believes he is on an objective quest for truth. But to move forward in science, you need to form a hypothesis. But as soon as you form a hypothesis, there is great danger that your objectivity will be undermined, particularly when the hypothesis relies on ideology that a scientist's career is personally invested in. I'd like to turn for the next few slides to Professor Mansfield's work on manliness. Very related work, and as you know, he's a professor who's also here at Harvard. He's not a scientist, but a historian and a political philosopher. So what does he say in his book, Manliness? First of all, he defines manliness as confidence in the face of risk again. We'll get more to risk. According to Mansfield, men are innately more aggressive, more assertive, they have more philosophical courage, they're better able to lead and command, they're more competitive, they're more ambitious. Any woman that shows these qualities he calls manly. Like Pinker, he says most stereotypes are justified and have an innate basis. Men disdain women's work, and also women. According to Mansfield, women show a secret liking for housework, may enjoy changing diapers. Okay. I'm not making this stuff up. I don't have time to go through all the things that he says in his book are just grossly not correct. But I do want to show you one example, because we keep hearing from these people that women are less willing to take risky actions, and it isn't true. And this is from a study recently published by Selwyn and Egley just a few years ago on the heroism of women and men. And what they looked at 5 different risky activities and who was more likely to take those risks. And 4 of the 5, it turned out to be women. Okay, and the only one where men were favored involved physical strength. So I'm telling everybody, male and female, when you hear stuff in the literature, from men or from women, because women are always as bad as the men when it comes to bias, more about that in a few minutes, be very skeptical. Ask to see the data, because even though you've grown up thinking such and such might be true, it might not be true. Always look at the data. I want to turn for a minute, because I think it's a related topic, to Mansfield's views on homosexuality, which he says he also obtains from the wisdom of the ancient philosophers. Okay, he has said that he thinks gay and transgender people are on society's margin and should remain there. He just said this a few years ago, and this is as quoted from the Harvard Crimson. Substitutes for the traditional family are dysfunctional. You wouldn't want children to grow up in them. Okay, well, first of all, this actually isn't true. There actually is data that addresses this. There are many studies. Even at the time that he said that, it was wrong. Children that grow up with gay parents are perfectly well adjusted. They're not more ostracized. There's no measure on which they do less well than other kids. It's just not true, and he must know it. He's also actively worked against gay rights. He's testified as a paid expert witness on a Colorado constitutional amendment prohibiting cities from enacting gay rights laws. And he says, right from around that time, gay sex is shameful. A homosexual is not generally as happy a person. Homosexuality should be tolerated but disapproved of, as if it is made respectable, it will eventually undermine civilization. Homosexuality should be restricted by the mechanism of shaming them. He also said homosexuality, rightly, causes most regular people to feel repulsed. Okay, comments like these cause incredible agony to gay students and prevent them from living open and full lives. So I decided to write an email to Harvey, and I wanted to show it to you. And this was after he was interviewed. You know, there were many newspaper and television interviews about his book, Manliness. And one of the interviewers in the New York Post said, "So Harvey, how's the hate mail?" Answer, "I got a note from a professor at Stanford saying Harvard fired Larry Summers. Why don't they fire you?" Okay, first of all, Harvard did not fire Larry Summers for his comments on women. He got a pay raise. So I wrote, "Dear Dr. Mansfield, please let me clarify. I believe in free speech, but I also believe that tolerance and freedom from sexual harassment are important values as well. What does tolerance mean to you? Is it always about your rights and your welfare? You don't have a right to tell young women in the classroom that they are innately less good and should content themselves to wash more dishes. It's not only incorrect, it's deeply harmful. And please don't worry about being fired. If history is any indication, you are in line for a big pay raise this year." Okay, so should his free speech be limited? I've really wrestled with what is right. I've concluded that we should not limit his free speech in any way, because as harmful as his views are, others need to be free to rebut them. But perhaps we can take the same view towards Harvey Mansfield as he takes towards homosexuals. We cannot stop his speech, but we can shame him in order to limit those like him. In an academic society, scholars are respected or not based on the quality of their thought. I have some questions for Harvey. First, does not your work on manliness tell us a lot more about you and your anxieties than it tells us about the actual subject? Why do you think it's fair that you can demand tolerance and rights to free speech for yourself from women, while you would gladly squelch their ability to participate fully and equally in the life of the university? And given that you so strongly oppose affirmative action, now that girls are 60% and rapidly increasing of the top applicants to universities, do you feel it is appropriate that universities are now conducting affirmative action for boys? Lastly, why are manly men so afraid to compete with women on a level playing field? I have a few other questions. It also must be asked, Harvey, is it possible you are as repulsed by confident, assertive women as you are by homosexuals? And what about me? Are you repulsed by me? My whole life, I've put my whole heart and soul into being the best scientist, neurologist, and teacher that I can be. I'm working hard to develop new treatments for neurological diseases, the diseases you may someday face. Are people like me really going to bring down civilization? Or do all lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered people deserve the same rights and dignity that you would accord to others like yourself? This is a great book, The Natural Superiority of Women by Ashley Montague, who taught at Harvard years ago. It was written 50 years before both Manliness and the Blank Slate, but it powerfully rebuts every word. Surprisingly, Pinker and Mansfield show no sign or concern or even awareness of the tremendously harmful nature of their writings. And so I'd like to next turn to the tremendous harmfulness of gender stereotypes. I've already told you about stereotype threat. There's many ways in which gender stereotypes are extremely harmful to young people, to all of us. Sexism drives women students from the classroom. When I was an MIT freshman, I took a physics course from Nobel laureate Viktor Weisskopf, and even though this was before my sensibilities were raised, it was so sexist that I had to drop the course. I couldn't stand to sit there and listen to this stuff. Gender stereotypes dim ambitions, and there's a great book and article by Anna Fels in which she argues that recognition is a fundamental emotional need and that confidence and expertise cannot be achieved without this recognition. It's necessary to drive ambition and sustain effort over the long term. Recognition is critical for career success and confidence. If women are less confident than men, this may well be social in origin. Gender stereotypes lower expectations of society for women. It lessens performance, lowers self-confidence. It prevents them from fulfilling limiting careers and makes leadership very difficult, as everyone can see who's been watching the things that have been said about Hillary Clinton in the news. I heard somebody say the other day, when Hillary talks, men here take out the garbage. But gender stereotypes are also harmful to men. Many men wrote to me after my commentary to tell me about the way gender stereotypes had affected them. Often they wanted to spend more time with their family and with their children, but they were told by their bosses that they should spend more time at work and less time with their family, because the family stuff was for the woman to do. Instead of recognition, many women in academia often report that they feel they are neglected by their largely male colleagues. They say that if they simply stopped coming into work, that no one would notice. And then they are told by people like Steven Pinker that their motivations are innately different, and thus they freely make different choices, with the implication that there is a scientific basis for these different choices. Now, I don't have time to review all the science about the harmfulness of gender stereotypes when it comes to overt discrimination, but the data are simply stunning. Everybody, male and female, should read these studies and be aware, because we all contribute. We all have studies. As I'll tell you, Mazrin Banaji has done studies. Women are as likely to view another woman as less competent as a man is. Okay, this is a social problem. We all have these biases. Virginia Valian has a book in which she reviews many of these studies, Why So Slow? And this terrific National Academy of Sciences report that just came out also has a chapter reviewing the latest data that show from gender blinding studies that women are less likely to be selected than men. In a postdoc fellowship competition, a woman had to write 3 times as many papers to get the fellowship compared to a man. And the most amazing description, everyone should read the last chapter of Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. What happened when symphony orchestras went to gender-blind auditions? And the number of women increased 5-fold. Okay, so I mentioned Mazrin, and as I said, I've given Steve Pinker and Harvey Mansfield a tough time, but they are public figures that enjoy taking controversial views, so they are easy targets. But Professor Banaji's work shows that we're all, to some extent, like Pinker and Mansfield. We all have biases. And these biases, and this is something very important that Dr. Banaji's work has shown, these biases influence the way we act and the judgments we make, and thus whether this world is a meritocracy or not. Okay, now I want to summarize before turning to a few concluding remarks about what can be done. First of all, is it tenable any longer to argue that women are innately less good at science, given all the evidence that I've just showed you? I've showed you that there's no demonstrated genetic or neurobiological basis. I've shown you that the test gap is rapidly shrinking, that genius test scores do not predict innovativeness. We don't know how to predict innovativeness. We don't know how to measure it. I've shown you that there's a scientifically proven degree of gender bias and discrimination that's stunning in its magnitude. You see that women are vastly underrepresented in humanities as well as science. Women outperform men in real-life science problem that I just showed you, test that I just showed you, and the only simple conclusion is that the dearth of women scientists is caused largely, if not entirely, by bias and social factors. Given these facts, for anyone to argue that an innate brain limitation accounts for why women are underrepresented in the professoriate is simply not scientifically credible. It is also deeply irresponsible because of the harm of stereotypes. If done in the classroom, it arguably constitutes sexual harassment. Yet women are still subject to this type of view, even here at Harvard, and even from its recent president. Not only was Summers not fired, he was given a pay raise, as well as an honorary degree. And this pay raise was given, perhaps even the honorary degree, by Hannah Gray, senior member of the Harvard Corporation. To be successful, women have long had to take on the attitudes and behavior of men in order to advance. The battle to be a woman leader and still be a woman is only just beginning. Being confident, ambitious, or competitive does not make a woman less of a woman. It is not shameful to be a woman. And it is not shameful to look out for the welfare of the half of students who are women. Women should not have to become men to succeed. University presidents have special responsibility. When Larry Summers refused to apologize and recant, I believe he should have been fired that week by the Harvard Corporation, just as James Watson was recently fired for his hurtful comments about African American ability. Someone with Summers' views cannot effectively promote faculty diversity, as was obvious during his tenure. I also like to say that I think that Nancy Hopkins is a great American hero. She was ridiculed and depicted as a hysterical woman, but she was absolutely right to be so angry about Larry Summers' comments denigrating women. It is tough to do what she has done. Her actions take real courage, Harvey. If more people had this kind of courage, the world would be a much better place. Instead, thanks to comments like those from Larry Summers, Steven Pinker, and Harvey Mansfield, as the 3,000 emails I received attest to, the hopes and dreams of millions of talented women are being raped and murdered. She is the one who should have received the honorary degree from Harvard last year. I think this is the best statement I've ever seen for the importance of diversity. And I'd like to just finish with a few words about the importance of diversity and what steps we might take to get better diversity at universities and our faculty. Educatability is the outstanding characteristic of the human species, and the variability both in physical and mental traits is so great that no two persons will ever be alike. It is in the combination of these traits that the great riches of humans lies. The strength of America is rooted in its diversity, and it is because you are different than me that you are precious to me. And I would argue that diversity is critical for all universities because it enhances the perspectives by which we analyze ideas and enhances the search for truth and the rate of innovation. And there's actually evidence for this. Obviously, drawing from a larger talent pool is only logical. Lowered stereotype threat would enable all to perform more optimally. Companies with more women board directors experience significantly higher financial performance. The same is true for companies with more racial or ethnic employees. Diverse groups contain mixed perspectives and think in new ways. This is a critical point. Anyone who's ever run a lab and been discussing a topic with their students, a group of students with different perspectives and different backgrounds, or a group of different scientists, knows that this is the fun of doing science, that when you have group thinking with diverse perspectives, you can go so much further in science. You can be so much more innovative. Now, I want to say a word about what happens to women in largely male environments, because I think it's very bad. I think that largely male environments are lethal to the careers of young women scientists. In such environments, women choose to leave science. When faculty leadership is diverse, there is a balance, and the atmosphere changes dramatically for the better for everyone, male and female. I am very concerned as I visit universities to find that women PhD students are already strongly doubting academic careers even in their first few years. And very importantly, university departments that have a high percentage of women faculty, such as Carleton College that has 50% chemistry faculty, unlike, for example, our almost 100% male faculty in chemistry at Stanford. These universities have been shown to have a much higher percentage of women graduates who are successful and stay in the pipeline. So I think that most of us agree that diversity is important. But somehow the faculty of universities are not diversifying at an appreciable rate. And this means that our current practices and procedures do not work well. Changes need to be made. What can be done? First of all, so I just have a few last slides to talk about what can be done. Very importantly, women, you must ask for what you need. And you need child care support. When Nobel laureate Rosalind Yalow spoke to a woman in science group at a major university many years ago, her opening statement was, "The primary problem is child care. Everything else is secondary." I watch talented young women assistant professors struggling to make tenure and raise babies, and I am convinced that one day in the life of a woman would kill any man. I look around today's university campuses and I question everything about the way dollars are allocated. Last year, after watching yet another talented woman at Stanford fail to make tenure while struggling to raise her babies, I decided to write a few angry messages to Stanford's president and provost. I would not recommend anyone do this before tenure. I asked them why, when they say they value faculty diversity, they had $100 million to buy a new football stadium for academically subpar boys to throw a ball around on the field. Yet, they did not provide funds to women assistant professors for a child care support salary supplement. But they were both terrific, our president and provost, and decided to address the problem. And Stanford is now the first university in this country to have such a salary support benefit of $20,000 per year for assistant professors, male and female, who have babies. I advise all of my women postdocs to negotiate for this benefit when they look at jobs. And if nothing else, women need to organize and push for better child care support. Individuals can accomplish a lot even by small actions. And this is just a brief list of a few of the things that I've done. There are things like this that we can all do. And I think for lack of time, I won't go through them. And then also, what about the schools themselves? I think if they care about the female brain drain, they must act. I think it's very important to take climate surveys. I've been very surprised as I visit women in universities with all-male departments at how demoralized the women are. When I visited a scientific institute at a famous university last year with largely male faculty, I had women tell me that they didn't know a single woman that wasn't demoralized and ready to drop out. The men just weren't reporting that level of demoralization. Studies have shown that women students get better grades from women professors. Is anyone besides me worried about whether Harvey Mansfield grades women fairly? I think we need to train women to achieve success in a prejudiced world. Selection committees must be more diverse. There must be more fairness in distribution of resources, like endowed chairs, which I see many universities largely go to men. We need to increase faculty diversity, and I don't know how we're going to do this because all male departments don't hire women very often. But we need to change the procedures by which we achieve faculty diversity, because if we don't, women will continue to leave the pipeline. I think there needs to be much more leadership diversity and accountability. It's fantastic to see this happening here at Harvard. I think that the new programs and policies that Harvard is putting into place are breathtakingly great. I think there's many other issues. If anyone's not watched this video from Professor Sandel's Justice course that's on the web, this is the most amazing teaching I've ever seen. And if every student were to take this course, I think it would be a much better world. And I hope they post all the lectures on the web, for no other reason than I want to watch them all. And so lastly, I want to say that ultimately each of us is responsible for ensuring social justice. The extent to which we are willing to engage in helping others different from ourselves defines our humanity. And on my final slide, I want to say that Steve Pinker says it's taboo to suggest that women are innately inferior. But I believe the greatest taboo by far is to think that women are not innately inferior. If we all truly believed this, then we would have to finally ask ourselves honestly why so few women are advancing and realize that the answer lies within all of our hearts. Thank you. very clever of me to speak so long, so now you can't ask me any hard questions.
Then we'll just postpone the reception.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
We do have some time for questions, so please stand up and say your question, and we will have Professor Barris respond. Do you want to sit down?
Oh, no, I'm fine, thank you.
I'm visiting, but I'm in computer science in another department where we have 3 women and 50 men. And
3 women and how many men?
41.
41, so I thought you said.
And it has been very clearly imposed that when I made the table, that the women are getting low salary than the men in their group. I, as well as my other colleagues, have the only labs without females. And these other students have to sit very close to each other, while there is no reason why I need to be in the space.
Yes. Well, this is, have you seen Nancy Hopkins' report from, yes. So this is,
I managed to make diversity committee, and it's just been really, really hard to change. And the people are not willing to admit, and when we talk about it, they make people feel like a troublemaker instead of
Yes.
saying reality.
yes, thank you very much for your question. Well, this is, I have received so many emails with people telling me things like this from all sorts of departments, which are largely male. And and also, I might add, in computer science departments, I can't tell you how many women students and postdocs have told me that they are being sexually harassed by the men in their department. And I've heard this in several different computer science departments. And so, men, you may not think it's much of anything. You may think it's funny or no big deal, but I assure you it's a really big deal. One of the reasons that women get paid less than men is that they don't ask for salary raises. I'm not saying that you haven't, but I just want to make a general comment that studies have shown that women tend to be a little shyer about asking. One of the reasons I think that women, so part of it's on women, but then one of the reasons that women, it's been shown, are shyer about asking for pay raises is it seemed as an assertive move, and assertive women are not well responded to and not well liked. And so it's been shown that male chairs respond much better. For all I know, female chairs respond much better to men when they ask for pay raises than women. And this makes it very hard. And I think that there needs to be some accountability here, that this is the sort of climate data that I was talking about. There should be somebody at a higher position at Harvard who is being told every year what the salaries of all the faculty are. And somebody needs to be looking at it, because you shouldn't be the one that has to be in this position to point this out. It puts you in a very bad position. And this is what I mean about climate surveys and accountability. It's simply not acceptable in this day and age that women receive less resources and less salary than men. And this, this is, I'm hopeful here at Harvard that things may change now that attention is being brought. And certainly the same thing with space as well. And also I would add that there are very few computer science departments that have women in computer science, and that you would be in a very good position to look for a job elsewhere and then ask Harvard to, if they want you to stay, to match that offer. And I can tell you that I did this myself when I was Barbara, and it's a very effective strategy because universities really want to increase their women faculty now. Yes?
I just have to clarify, she's not at Harvard.
Ah.
Harvard does also have only 3 women faculty, but we only have 15 faculty.
I'm sorry, I just assumed you were from Harvard.
Thanks for coming, Dr. Barris. I was curious, I read today's Crimson about the Putnam math competition, and noticed that there was a special prize for high-achieving women in the competition. I wonder what your opinion is on how setting aside a specific prize for women's achievement impacts social views, because I don't know whether I would have beforehand assumed that there would have been less female success in the Putnam competition, but that indicated to me very strongly that, yes, there is less.
You see, well, I have mixed feelings about that. First of all, I gather that more and more women are winning the Putnam. Of course, the Putnam is the extreme of the extreme, elite mathematical achievement, and so it's going to take longer for them to break into that. So that just the fact that there have been at least some women winning the Putnam, clearly shows that at least some women can perform at that level. And I'm assuming that as all the test gap scores shrink, that the situation will get better. The reason I have mixed feelings about it is because it is true. There's a lot of evidence that women don't get the recognition that men get when they perform well. I have an example in my commentary about how I was the only student in an MIT class to solve a math problem, and rather than being patted on the back, I was told that I must have cheated. And so I think that recognition, and this is the point that Anna Fels make, for men and for women, is critical in getting people to put in the long hours and sort of to drive their ambitions. Nobody wants to feel they won something just because they're a woman. And so that's why I have a mixed feeling about it. And also, perhaps men would resent if there's special prizes for women that aren't. Why shouldn't there be a special prize for the best male performer or something like that? So I have very mixed feelings about this, and I guess that's all I can say. If anybody else has any thoughts, feel free to raise them.
So, kind of on a related note, the Association for Computing Machinery has an international programming contest. I went to the World Finals a few years ago, and out of 81 teams with 3 people each, there was exactly 1 female contestant. And not only is that remarkable in and of itself, but when asked about what they were doing, if anything, to promote or encourage women to actually participate at all, the director went on to explain in much the same way as some of the people we mentioned today, that men and women are different and so forth. And at the same time, there's clearly a recognition of the disparity by someone, because the one female contestant seems to make it into all the photographs. And I find it very remarkable that we have such a kind of 2 very different perspectives operating at the same time. If you had any thoughts.
Yeah. Well, one thought that I have is that Beth Stevens, that picture of one of the beautiful blonde postdocs in my lab, she is terrific, and she's been interested in science since she was little. And a few years before she came to my lab, she was working at NIH, and a school teacher at a nearby school asked her if she would come visit the third grade class. And before she walked into the door, the teacher said to the class, "Okay, today we're going to have a scientist visit us so that you can learn what it's like to be a scientist. But before this guest comes in, why doesn't everybody sit down and draw their picture of what they think a scientist looks like?" And every student, and studies have shown this, so this was not just a fluke, every student, and this is still true today, virtually every student draws a picture of a man, that's usually a geeky man with glasses. Kind of looks like me, usually. So they did that, and then she invited the guest into the room, my student, and the class just exploded in surprise. No way, she's a girl, she can't be a scientist. And so I think that these biases, that women aren't good in math and science and computers and so forth, happen extremely early. And so my own view is that as these social forces lessen, this is the famous Hungarian mathematician Paul Erdős's view as well, that the forces are so strong that women are told they can't be scientists from the earliest possible age. They feel they will not be feminine, that isn't something that a girl should do. I think I see that, I hear what you're saying, and I don't think men and women are different. I think the difference is in the social forces, but obviously we need much more research.
I'm a student in biophysics, and I have 2 children. And I'm curious that you mentioned that you felt that faculty on the tenure track should have 3 years here. But given that women graduate students would be considered the optimal age for having children, and that achieving tenure would be easier if your children were older, why do you only advocate help for childcare for students?
Thank you very much. I do not only advocate I was just a particular example of one case where I argued, and it was more just a realistic sense of how many dollars would be available and where could we, use those dollars in a critical way to address women that, to keep them in the pipeline. And I completely agree with you that it would be better, if there was more support for women as graduate students and postdocs. I don't know if there are any schools that do this, but I'll tell you why there isn't more help. Because you don't ask for it. And, if women are now half the people, and, why do we have to have football stadiums over child care support? It's because the men want the football and the women aren't asking for the child care. No offense, guys, I don't like football. Now, hockey is a different story. But seriously, it'd be nice to have them both. But I think that, I see that there's a very big endowment here. I've been reading about it. And so, I would push. Another thing I would say about that, women outlive men, and that means they die with all the money. And so why can't we be asking women donors for more support to help young women succeed in science? I think that it would be nice. So I totally agree with you.
Can I just make a comment about that? So what we're trying to do here at Harvard is to provide increased child care support for junior faculty who are in junior faculty, but also for students and also postdocs. So we are working very hard on building those support for students as well as for faculty who most need, as well as for staff who are low-grade learners as well. So we are taking a comprehensive approach.
Awesome.
Not there yet, but we're really
Awesome.
working very hard.
That's really great.
Well, I agree with what you said.
No.
I'm Margaret Geller, and I'm one of the 5 or 6 women who are members of the National Academy of Physics. And one of the things that I found very frustrating in my career is that the higher up you go in science, the fewer women there are, and the harder it is to change it. That even when women are nominated for high-level prizes, and they don't get them. That even when women are nominated for membership in the academy, they don't get in. There's a very serious problem at the nomination level, but even when someone fights to change the outcome, it doesn't persist. And so I had a couple of experiences with this. I served on the council of the National Academy, and during the time I was on the council, the fraction of women elected to the academy went up, because there was enormous pressure from me and others on the academy. And as soon as I was off, as soon as the president changed, down it went. So
of course, I'm not an academy member, but I would just guess, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, that there's a largely male group of people that's making the decisions.
Right.
And I think one can make a very strong case that that is not appropriate, that there must be a diverse committee that's a permanent change in the way new members are selected.
But how do you get there? I mean, the specifics.
I find, in my case, anger is incredibly effective.
Interesting. It hasn't worked for me.
I would say organize. I would say organize, because I think it's very hard for single women. The anger thing, they're just seen as an angry woman. But I think if you have a group of angry women, and maybe with some men, that are angry, that it starts to be more effective. And I think it is simply and I think now is a good time to push for this. So I've spent the last 2 or 3 years fighting with Howard Hughes to get them to go to an open nomination system, which they did finally go to this year. And this was a long fight that took.
So by open, you mean, could you be more specific?
Anybody can nominate. You don't get nominated by your university. Because the old way, basically only men were getting nominated. Now everybody can, it's equal opportunity. And there's a hopefully diverse selection committee and so, but the point is that, honestly, I spent a lot of time writing letters to the Howard Hughes leadership saying, look, the NIH pioneer people did this, we should do this. Look, here's some tables of data about how little diversity you have. Here are all these great women that should be Howard Hughes investigators that aren't. And they never even had the chance in their life to apply once, and so forth, and that got me nowhere. And in fact, when they finally decided, I finally got them to put it on their agenda for a summer meeting. They commissioned a famous woman scientist long associated with Howard Hughes to make the report, and she reported that everything was just fine the way it was. Okay, this is what you face. This is what you face. And so then I realized that the way to do this is to get other people that the top leadership would respect, other Nobel laureates, male and female, and other senior, and I got them all to do a write-in and talk to them. And finally they put it on the agenda again, and finally they decided and I understand that it's been such a great success that they're going to keep this way of doing things in the future. We'll see if the output is diverse. But I think that given this, it could be easily argued that it is patently unfair to have an all-male or a largely male selection committee do this. I mean, I would be happy to sign or do anything to help in that battle.
Hi, I work for Harvard College's Program for Research in Science and Engineering, which is a result from the Women in Science Task Force. And my question for you is more, what advice would you give young women who have already fallen out of or chosen to not participate in the science pipeline that are interested in re-entry?
How far did you go before you left? I'm sorry?
Bachelor's in science.
Ah, I see. And how old are you?
25.
Oh, that's nothing.
Women in general.
The advice I would give any woman and any man is pick your mentors very wisely. If you want to stay on in science for a long time, pick a mentor who has a track record of training good scientists that stay in the pipeline, and preferably including good women scientists. And most students don't do that. They pick a mentor who does the tiny little research thing they want to study, and they don't even think that it matters. But all scientists aren't created equal. All good scientists aren't created equal as far as mentorship. And so that, I think, is the, pick your. It also helps to pick your husband wisely too, because they should help with the baby and stuff.
I'm a foundation experience from one of my personal heroes is at Columbia University, and there's been a lot of teaching on half she wrote an article, I think it was a few years ago, about how she responds when people ask her why aren't there more women in science. And that article was about her response that she developed, which is that she's a scientist first, and she's not a social scientist. And she feels that her area of expertise doesn't enable her to answer that question in a way that maybe it should be answered. And I identify with that. If you spend so much time just thinking about physics, how can you answer that question in a way that does it justice? And so I wondered how you get advice for that.
Well, I could see her point of view, but on the other hand, I could say that we all have a responsibility to work, especially the senior women that have made it through. And I think that, I forget how old you said she is. How old is she? But I find that highly successful women often don't work to help other women. And I think that there's this denial thing going on here that they think if they did it, anybody could do it. I've been at Stanford 15 years. I've never seen any senior woman scientist. And I'm in a medical school, so there's rampant discrimination happening. And I've never seen any woman speak up to help younger women. So I think that this is, maybe this was something of their generation, that you really have to almost take on a male perspective to succeed. And I hope that your generation will be more proactive this way. Yes.
In addition to that, one of the problems that I've seen is I have always been women as mentors, and often they're not trained. And they have said to me explicitly, I can't help you with this. It will risk you. So you're stuck. They're not allowed to tenured women, and so tenured women can't sacrifice themselves for you.
Yes. I'm not sure if, I know that many women pick women mentors because they're so desperate for a role model. And I have mixed feelings about that. I really feel that if you want to yourself stay in the pipeline and increase the number of women mentors, that the primary consideration should be finding the very best mentor you can. And in a department where you've got largely men and only a few women mentors, if you can find, if that woman that you're interested in is the best mentor you can find, by all means, pick her lab. But don't pick her lab because she's a woman. Pick her lab because she's a good scientist, and she's a great mentor, and she's a woman. And so that's one thing that occurs to me, but yeah.
Question here, and then over there to Benson.
when you're training scientists in your labs, do you try to be gender blind, or do men and women need different things from a gender?
I think that men and women need the same things. They need, when I train men and women in my lab, do I treat them differently or treat them the same? Well, I mean, for the female-specific things like having babies and things like that, of course I'm supportive, and I mean, that's not, and that's something female-specific, but although men sometimes have babies and have paternity leaves as well. So generally, I think I'm the same, but I think that all students need a lot of encouragement and recognition when they're doing good work, and being told when they're doing good work, and that you have faith in them and high expectation for them. And I think that's particularly true with women because they tend to have less self-confidence. And so I try to be aware of the messages that I'm signaling and not just patting the men on the back and forgetting about the women, that sort of thing. But I've always had exactly half men and half women in my lab at every level. And I don't pay any attention to the gender when people apply to my lab. It just happens that way. If you take the best people when they apply, given how many women and men are in the pipeline now, it just tends to work out as equal. And I think it's really great. I try, though, to keep a gender balance because I think that it creates an environment that's much more healthful for everyone. Women don't like to be the only woman. Men don't like to be the only man.
Cross-cultural studies are really, really important in being a issue. We seem to be, at least in the discussion here, mostly talking about the United States. And I think some of the attitudes we're grappling with are so diffused throughout society that it's actually becomes difficult to expose the rest of these questions. I just want to relate one incident. For many years, I was working in Thailand, teaching in Thailand, former student of mine as a professor at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand, sometimes referred to for better or worse as a Harvard. And she's a chemistry professor. She had helped start a department of petroleum engineering, and she introduced me to three assistant professors, three or four assistant professors for new colleagues in that department. They were all women. I was astounded. Not that women could do petroleum engineering, but that an engineering department would have, nothing but women as assistant professors. And so I think we need to really look more outside the United States as a way of exposing the things that get so taken for granted that we hardly recognize that we are taking them for granted here in the United States.
Yeah. Well, it'd be interesting to know if there were so few women in computer science in some of these other cultures. Are there? Oh.
So we'll take a couple more questions. One there. Just to clarify what you were saying, I grew up in Venezuela. I lived in Italy, and I lived in the US for a long time. And the attitudes towards women in science are very, very different. And while Venezuela's society might be do tend to treat women as objects and so on, I never felt discouraged to go into science. There were so few that we actually encouraged me to go into science on the grad. And as we came to Italy has exactly, you would think they have essentially gone away from the biases all the way exactly to the PhD. But then you find a big glass ceiling when professors come, where you still have a very wide male, very old faculty. And it was only when I came to the US that I realized there was such a big bias in high school that I never thought that that was it at all.
That's very interesting. I did a practice talk with my lab on Friday, and one of the African American students in my lab came up to me afterwards, and he made the point that, so he grew up in Barbados, and he made the point that he grew up there for about his first 16 years of his life or so. He made the point that if he'd grown up in this country rather than Barbados, he would have never gotten as far as he's gone academically, just because the attitudes are so different.
So I just have one question for you. And as I was a postdoc here at Harvard, and now I've got a tenure track at a lab in Chicago. And the thing that I felt the most after going through this process of practice is that, well, you're in all the short list because you're a woman. I got
how do you, or your particular design topic, you can respond to that?
Well, well, it makes my blood boil. I was very surprised when I visited Ken Manning and the students at MIT. I was meeting with some of the African American students, and several of them told me that other students came up to them and said, well, you're just here because you're black, when they knew nothing about that student or what his credentials or capabilities were. And so, anybody who's ever attempted to say anything like that, just bottle it, And the other thing is, my feeling though about this is it's so important to increase the number of women on the faculty, and women have been subject to so much bias for so long that just suck it up and just get that job, because you're going to be in a position to help. Nobody likes to be hired because they're a woman, and in the end, you're going to, when you get tenure, you're going to show them all that they didn't know what they were talking about anyway. But
as we leave here today, what do you recommend that we do to perpetuate the kind of the inspiration that you've brought to all of us here? I know what it is, but I'd like to hear those.
So at the very last thing that I suggested on my list of possible things to do is, I keep thinking it would be great if students would form a new type of alliance, like a gay-straight alliance, but for everybody, a social justice alliance. Because, for example, when I visited MIT, I was very upset that Professor James Shirley, who's an African-American, didn't get tenure. He was a Pioneer Award winner, an extremely talented scientist, and would be an extremely fantastic role model. And MIT now has 10% African-American students or so. Is that right? Is it 10% students in the undergrad class? And so I was very upset they didn't tenure him. And so I asked some of the black students that I was talking to, why didn't you fight? Why don't you fight? Why don't you go to the president or the provost and say, this is critical for your education, have more diversity of the faculty? And, they're just so busy and overloaded, and they can't fight every battle themselves. And, we all have to work together. If we all work together, we're all different in so many different ways. If we all work together, it will be so much more powerful, and it will be so much more meaningful. I can tell you, I mentioned a time in my commentary, but there have been a few times when, a man has stepped forward to say, when observed a woman or something harmful to women, and then some man who has stepped forward to say, hey, this is not right. Like the example I give in my commentary is when I was a medical student, the professor, the anatomy professor shows the nude pinup in class, and it was a male student that went to the professor after class and said, hey, that's not right, And when Larry Summers made his comments, Greg Petsko at Brandeis wrote this fabulous commentary about why, basically why he didn't agree with Larry Summers. And so those things really mean a lot, and I think that having a group of people, just like with the National Academy thing that you were mentioning, if you have a group of people working together, a diverse group of people, they can be very much more influential. And I would also like to say, students have more energy than everybody else. And I would also like to say that I sit on a lot of admissions committees, and when I'm admitting students, they're all smart, but the way they really differ is by whether they care about anybody else except themselves. And so, that means a lot to me.